What's up everybody, how's it going? It's Burke aka Dansquate here and welcome back to another Final Fantasy X video. In this one we're going to be having a look a little bit at the history of Final Fantasy X through the changes that have happened to the game. Now, especially back in 2001, this idea of releasing a game and then having patches that would be added later on to improve or to change certain things wasn't a part of video games. Whatever we had on the disc was what we ended up getting, and that's what we lived with. And so that made me think, what has actually changed between the versions of the game that first came out and the one that we're most likely to play today, which is of course the HD remaster version that's going to be on Steam, PS4, PS5, Nintendo Switch, or one of those modern day consoles. And it's actually pretty interesting. There's some things in here that I'm sure you're already going to be aware of that have changed, but there's some more subtle things that you might have not realized have changed since the first release. So that's what this video is going to look into, and without much further ado, let's get straight into it and have a look at some things that have changed in Final Fantasy X since the first releases in 2001. The information I'm going to share here is a mix of things I already know, but it's also added to the list that the Final Fantasy Wikia has for version changes since 2001 for Final Fantasy X. I'm going to be adding some of my own context and some of my own extra information to some of these. It won't be absolutely extensive so that I can keep the runtime a little bit lower and I don't repeat myself with similar types of changes and things like that. There's going to be so many little micro changes and adjustments and things that we haven't documented on a public big forum like the Final Fantasy Wikia that I'm sure in the comments there'll be some more changes that are going to be mentioned that I didn't find or know about either. So now we can talk about where the story began for Final Fantasy X. Of course, the first version of the game that ever came out was on July the 19th, 2001, and it was the original Japanese version of the game. Now, just 5 months later, on December the 17th, 2001, there was a North American version of the game that was released, and the first time that players could natively play the game in English. And already, just between this Japanese and American version release, there was already some important changes that happened in the game. So let's have a look at some of these. The first one I'm going to start with is pretty interesting, and it's something that I didn't know for a very long time about Final Fantasy X. In the original Japanese version of the game, if you win the Blitzball match against the Lucagoas and win the Blitzball Cup, you actually only end up getting a potion, which is kind of hilarious because it's a pretty difficult thing to do, and you're only rewarded with a potion instead of a strength sphere, which is way more useful for the player. Another thing that changed was actually within the Bevelle Temple Cloister of Trials. Now, I know that we've all found it pretty annoying when you have to stop the platform at one of those changing arrows and pick the right one, and if you go in the wrong direction you can waste a lot of time. Now, what I didn't know was that in the original Japanese version this was actually even worse. The arrows only changed every 8 frames in the Japanese version of the game, but from the North American version onwards it actually changes every 25 frames instead of 8. So it was literally 3 times faster in the original Japanese version, which seems pretty insane. It's a pretty interesting change. That Cloister of Trials must have been even more annoying in the original Japanese version. One thing we of course are all very used to is the monster arena, and the fact that there is a save sphere behind the trainer in the monster arena. Again, another thing I didn't know was that in the very first version of the game that was released, there's actually no save sphere behind the trainer. Now, I can't even imagine how inconvenient that would have been because you spend so much time there. The fact that there wasn't a save sphere there must have just made things really annoying. So the fact they added it was of course a very good idea, but it only happened in the North American version in December 2001. Another little quality of life improvement that happened after the first version of the game was the fact that you can sort equipment automatically in the menu. This is something that is obviously useful because it can group them into each individual character's equipment, and if you're anything like me, you're terrible at organizing that stuff manually, so just having like a quick automatic organization tool for the menu was very, very useful. But once again, it was not present in the very first version of the game that shipped in Japan. This next change is actually something that's pretty big in my opinion, and it's the fact that the HP critical threshold was actually 25% in the first version of the game. We all know it as 50%, and whenever you drop below half health, stuff like SOS abilities will kick in and their HP numbers will turn yellow. But this was originally 25%, which is pretty crazy. It's quite a major difference, and it could have affected certain battles in a major way depending on what your strategy and your setup was. As a little sub thing to do with the HP critical threshold, whenever Yuna's Aeons go into the critical HP threshold, they slouch down so you can get an idea of how much HP they have left. And again, in subsequent versions of the game and the ones that we play, Whenever an enemy Aeon is below 50%, you'll also know they'll be slouching. But again, in the original version of the game, the enemy Aeons never had the slouching animation when they were below 50%. This was changed in the North American version of the game. So the next couple of things are to do with localization and some things that have been changed since the original Japanese version of the game. The first one we're going to talk about is to do with celestial weapons, and I'm sure many of you have come across this information before, but for those of us who have only ever played the English versions of the game, we will know the celestial weapon for Tidus as the Kaladbolg and Kimahri's one as the Spirit Lance. But for people who've played the Japanese versions of the game and who have played other languages like for example German or Spanish, they would actually know them by a different name. So the Kaladbolg in the original Japanese release was known as Ultima Weapon, and Kimahri's Spirit Lance was known as the Longinus or the Longinus. I'm not sure how you pronounce it, but that's the name that it had. Now this is kind of interesting because obviously once they changed the name for the North American English version, all subsequent English versions had Kaladbolg and Spirit Lance, but for all of the other localizations it's pretty much always been Ultima Weapon and Longinus. So even if you're playing, let's say you've only ever played the game in German even since the PS2 days, then you've pretty much always known those weapons by a different name to what all of the English speaking players would have. So that's one of the more interesting changes, but I guess technically it's only really a change for people who've played the game in English. If you've only ever played the Japanese versions, or you've only ever played, let's say, the German version, your localization would be pretty much the same as the Japanese OG anyway. So another localization change related to this one is also a little bit weird, and it can cause a little bit of confusion, and that is to do with the celestial objects that are associated with the celestial weapons. So in the original Japanese, the associations we had are different from the associations that we would know if we've only played the English versions of the game. So to break this down, in the original, Lulu had the Mars association, Wakka was Mercury, Kimahri was Jupiter, Riku was Venus, and Auron was Saturn. Now for us that have only played the English versions, that's really weird because it's so ingrained in our heads if we played the game a lot which association belongs to which character, that it always confused me when I found out that that wasn't actually the case in the original Japanese. So those are the original Japanese ones. But of course, once we got to the North American version of the game, I think they tried to do the localization in a way that matched their characters a little bit better, because again, in that sort of mythology, Mars is to do with war, and Auron is more of like the prototypical warrior kind of character. So I think they wanted to swap some of that around to make it fit a little bit better. So it's not really a big deal, but the fact that there's this discrepancy, and the Japanese versions of the game have always stuck with that throughout their different versions, has always created a little bit more confusion. So the associations that we had as of the North American version is that Lulu is associated with Venus, Wakka with Jupiter, Kimahri with Saturn, Riku with Mercury, and Auron with Mars. Now, to add another layer to this, once again, just like the previous point that I mentioned, if you've only ever played versions of the game like the German one, or the Italian one, or the Spanish one, these guys have pulled their associations from the original Japanese. So once again, for you guys, it's going to be the case that your associations are going to be the same as the original Japanese. One final piece of confusion to just make this even worse, apparently for the Nintendo Switch versions, they decided to go with the Japanese associations, even though the game is in English. So that's like a final layer of annoying confusion, just to mix things up a little bit more. I always knew that they were different, but I always thought it was just there's one for the Japanese and one for all of the other languages, but it's not quite that simple, unfortunately. Of course, one thing that patches often fix is glitches, and you can consider these subsequent versions of Final Fantasy X as almost being like update patches. And so one glitch that I've never seen myself, but I will be trying to trigger it myself as I record B-roll for this video, is the fact that you could encounter piranhas when you were running around on the salvage ship, which is obviously a bit of a weird glitch because you're above the waterline and you suddenly get attacked by piranhas and you switch to an underwater arena. So this was a glitch in the original version that was fixed in the North American version onwards. But then one of my favorite glitches, which I discovered very recently and that I have a video on, is one that allows you to break the Capture Chocobo minigame and basically never get hit by the birds in the race. If you want to find out more about this, I really advise you to check that video, it's a lot of fun. But this particular glitch was only ever present on the original Japanese version of the game, and it was fixed for all subsequent versions. Then, on the 31st of January 2002, we had the Final Fantasy X International version. Now, we did have some changes between the first ever Japanese version and the North American version, but the international version truly was quite a big change for Final Fantasy X, and a lot of things were either altered or new things were completely added in, as we'll be discussing in this section of the video. So one of the first things that's important to note is that the international version had the English voice acting and primarily was designed for obviously international players, but they still had their Japanese players in mind, because this was the only PS2 version of the game where you could switch between having Japanese subtitles or you could have English subtitles. Now, this ended up making a few little changes in the localization because Yojimbo went back and altered some of the Japanese subtitles to match the English voice acting that was going to be used in this version. So, for example, in the Japanese dialogue they used the word machine, and of course, as we know, in the English version they say the word machina instead of machine. So what Yojimbo went back and did was to alter the Japanese subtitles so that it matched the English voice acting more accurately. But of course, it would be remiss for me to not talk about the infamous thank you versus I love you at the end of Final Fantasy X. If you don't know what I'm talking about, I think it's worth taking a little bit of time to just mention this. But in the original Japanese version of the game, due to how they wrote the script and the customs in Japan and the culture that they have there, in the final FMV when Tidus is about to jump off the airship and he's going to fade away, Yuna actually says thank you in the original Japanese version, so that's always been the case. But when they localized the game into English, they changed it to I love you, because I think within the English language and the more Western English culture, US culture, that kind of thing, I think for that scene and for that context, if you are a native English speaker, I think it's much more natural to have her say I love you, given the fact that they clearly do love each other. And I think in that moment it's just a much more powerful and appropriate way to say it. So I think localization wise it was the right call, but technically it's not a correct translation of what was originally said in Japanese. Now, the reason why this is also important for this particular section is that if you play the Final Fantasy X International version with the Japanese subtitles, of course the Japanese subtitles have been altered so that it matches the English voice acting. So in that scene, Yuna will say I love you and the Japanese subtitles will reflect that too. So this is pretty much the only version of the game that's ever been released that will have Yuna saying I love you with the Japanese subtitles as well, which is pretty interesting. One of the changes that for me is actually quite important, especially back in the day it was pretty important for me, was the fact that the font is actually changed for the damage numbers and the healing numbers. When I used to watch Final Fantasy X videos back in the very early days of YouTube, back then there were still a lot of people that were playing the original North American version, but there were also people that were playing the international and the PAL version of the game in Europe. Now, for me, especially as someone that was interested in Dark Aeons, which we're going to move on to later on, sometimes knowing which version of the game was being played was important for me when I was watching a video. And one of the most telltale signs that I was watching the North American version, or I was watching a later version of the game, was which font the damage numbers were appearing in when I watched the video. I've got so used to like the font that I know and love from the PAL version onwards that I always found the North American version of the font and the original Japanese one, of course, a bit weird. And this is pretty much the font that they stuck with for the rest of the releases from 2002 onwards. Now we get on to some pretty legitimate gameplay changes and things that were pretty noticeable for players that truly made it feel like a significant update over the original version of the game. There were 8 new abilities that were added. There were 4 extract abilities, extract power, mana, speed, ability. Then you had full break, which inflicts armor break, magic break, mental break, and power break. You had the nab gil ability, so that you could steal gil from enemies while attacking. You had pilfer gil, which was stealing gil from enemies. And you had the move Quick Pockets, which is of course a very important move, especially in the P. Birdman mod. I made use of it quite a lot. It's a very quick way to use items that is very beneficial when you're in a tight spot. So that was only added from the international version in 2002 onwards and didn't exist in the original Japanese or North American versions of the game. Another one of the biggest changes that we get to enjoy now in pretty much every version of the game we play that wasn't around in the early days is of course the fact that we have access to the Expert Sphere Grid. Now, I'm not going to go too deep into this, but the Expert Sphere Grid is basically a different arrangement of the Sphere Grid which allows for greater freedom in the way that you use your characters and the abilities that you give them. So this was pretty significant, and it gave people a different way to play the game, especially the second time around, if they've already done it using the normal sphere grid. So a pretty major change. One change is the fact that we had the ribbon ability added for armors. Ribbon, of course, is absolutely huge. It's an ability that's been present in Final Fantasy over the years, but originally it was missing from Final Fantasy X and only arrived after the international versions of the game in 2002. And that would have made a big difference, because I'm going to segue on to the next major change that, of course, is probably one of the most famous ones, and that's the fact that the international version onwards contained the Dark Aeons and Penance. Some people who are not familiar with the very early releases, because it's so old now, might not know this, but in the original Japanese and the original North American version that was played by millions of people around the world, there were no Dark Aeons and there was no Penance in those releases of the game. And so yes, of course, you can imagine that as they brought the Dark Aeons in, an ability like Ribbon became a lot more important, because in pretty much every build that is recommended for the Dark Aeons and Penance, Ribbon is an ability that makes your life a lot easier. It's not absolutely necessary, but it does help out a lot, especially in those Dark Aeon battles. Another major change that I think is pretty important is one that I've actually highlighted in a CTB breakdown video I did, again, recently on the channel. It's super technical and in-depth, but I think it's one of my favorite videos that I did, because I just got super deep and nerdy about Final Fantasy X, and I really unearthed a lot of information about the CTB system and did my best to learn it myself and to share it in a way that would help you understand better and master the way Final Fantasy X works in terms of its turn order and structure. Now, this is important because one of the major changes that happened once the international versions came out was that Quick Hit as an ability was changed. It was nerfed in a pretty significant way. The first way is the fact that it costs 3 times as much MP to use now. It used to only cost 12 MP, but it went up to 36 MP for the international version and all subsequent versions of the game. But even more importantly, previously it used to be a rank 1 move, and it got demoted into being a rank 2 move. The TLDR of this is that Quick Hit used to be insanely quick in the Japanese and North American versions, but they nerfed it to make it slower in the international version onwards. And if you want a bigger breakdown of that and what the ranks mean and what the actual difference looks like between using it in the Japanese version versus the HD remaster, for example, you should definitely check out that CTB video. It's a gold mine of information for people curious about the mechanics of Final Fantasy X. If you were someone who was using Auron for the end game and you wanted to use his celestial weapon, of course, because you want to fight and defeat the most difficult bosses in the game, the damage scaling for the Masamune was actually changed from the earliest versions of the game. As hopefully we already know, the way Auron's Masamune works is that the less HP he has, the more powerful he becomes. So if you have a factor of 1 when he has full HP, in the original versions of the game, he did 4.33 times as much damage when he was at 1 HP. Now, for people who know the game pretty well, you're already going to realize that that's a pretty significant difference, because in the subsequent versions of the game, he only does 0.5x at full HP. So between the two versions, Auron only does half as much damage from the international version onwards, and when he's at 1 HP, he only does 2.167 times as much damage. So Auron got a pretty significant nerf with his celestial weapon in the subsequent releases of the game, which is a bit of a shame, because I do love the fact that his celestial weapon has that mechanic and it is unique to him, but it was even more powerful in the original versions of the game. You know you've made a lot of Final Fantasy X content when you try to make a video like this and you keep referring to other videos that you've already made, and this is another one. Again, this is pretty significant in my book. I've made multiple videos about the fact that Yojimbo Zanmato is the most powerful move in Final Fantasy history. Then I went a step further and I broke down the mechanics of Zanmato, how it works, what are the percentage chances, how do you influence the chance of a Zanmato, and all of those videos, again, they're going to be in the description and available for you guys to watch if you've never seen them. It's really interesting stuff. But what we're going to talk about here, of course, is a change that happened to Yojimbo over the years. In the original versions of Final Fantasy X, the Japanese and the North American version, it was actually a lot more difficult to get Yojimbo to use a Zanmato. To give you some numbers on this, for any given situation, no matter what parameters you have in place, you can give him as much gil as you want, you can have his motivation as high as you want, he can have a full overdrive, you could be fighting a dingo in Besaid, everything is absolutely as favourable as it could be to receive a Zanmato from him. the highest percentage chance that you could get in the Japanese or the original North American version was only 58%, which is pretty insane. From the international version in 2002 onwards, Yojimbo Zanmato became even more deadly, and the odds of you receiving one drastically increased, so Zanmato got a massive boost in the later releases. Another big change is the way that the game treats certain important moves that hit multiple times in the game. So I'm going to tell you about 3 moves that originally used to only do damage once, that in later releases ended up doing multiple hits. The first one is Auron's Tornado move. In the original versions of the game, it only hit 1 time, but in later versions, as we all know, Auron's Tornado actually hits twice. One of the biggest moves is Anima's Oblivion. Oblivion used to only hit 1 time in the original versions of the game, and of course since you have a damage cap as well, it could never do more than 99,999 damage, which was a massive shame. But in the later versions of the game, as I'm sure many of us have seen, Anima's Oblivion hits 16 times instead. Now the damage constant is lowered in a big way. It used to be that it did 1 hit with 75 power, then it dropped to 16 hits at a power of 4. But of course, if your anima is super strong, even that damage constant of 4 is enough to just do insane amounts of damage, all the way up to 1.6 million if it's hitting for max damage against an enemy. So Oblivion got a massive boost in the later versions of the game. The final one is the Maga Sister's Delta attack. Previously, it used to only hit once and had a damage constant of 60, but international version onwards, it hits 6 times with a damage constant of 10. And again, because of the damage limit situation, it became a lot more dangerous and deadly, especially against enemies that were weaker and that had lower defenses in the international version of the game onwards. One thing that many of us of course hate in Final Fantasy X is the monster capturing process. Capturing 10 of every single enemy in the game can definitely be annoying and can be a difficult thing to do, depending on what stage of the game you're trying to do it in. Now, as someone who's done this with no sphere grid restrictions, I can definitely vouch for how annoying it is to try to capture Behemoth King if you get it wrong, and he uses a pretty damn powerful meteor to wipe out your party instead of being captured. One thing that I think, again, many people won't know, myself included until I did some research for this, was that in the original release of the game, Behemoth King, even if you captured it, would still use Meteor at the end. Now, can you imagine if you're trying to do a no sphere grid run, or your party is pretty low level, and you've tried to capture this guy, and he unleashes a Meteor even though he's been captured, the amount of times that your party would still get wiped out anyway would have been really frustrating. And of course you have to capture 10 of these guys. Thankfully, again, international version onwards in 2002, they took that away so that when you do capture the Behemoth King, it doesn't retaliate with a meteor before it dies. Now, as you've seen, there's been a lot of changes so far that will benefit the player, and I think as a result, they decided to make some small increases to the difficulty of some of the enemies in the game. Mostly it's going to be enemies that you encounter either inside Sin or in the Omega Ruins. Again, I'm not going to go over every single one here and every single change, but there are some subtle changes. I'll give you one example. If you encounter a black element in the Omega Ruins, their magic stat goes up from 28 to 33 in later versions, defense goes up from 240 to 250, and magic defense goes up from 1 to 30. And there's a bunch of changes like this for enemies that you'll encounter in the Omega Ruins or inside Sin. But I do think a couple that's worth going into bigger detail is, first of all, Ultima Weapon, which is a more subtle change. Ultima Weapon's HP goes up from 70,000 to 99,999. It now gains MP points, it goes up from 1 to 99. But the final and slightly more significant change is the fact that the agility of Ultima Weapon goes up from 28 to 32. Now, if you're thinking that's a pretty small change, that's not really going to affect too much, the chances are you probably didn't watch my big stat mechanics video, because in that video I talk about how agility relates to something called tick speed, which determines how quickly your turns arrive. And of course the developers wouldn't make an increase from 28 to 32 if it made no tangible impact on the battle. Now 28 gives you a tick speed of 9, but 32 gives you a tick speed of 8, and even though it's not a massive change, it's definitely enough to slightly influence the battle. That slight decrease in tick speed from 9 to 8 could make a little bit of a difference if you're already pretty low level and you're struggling against Ultima Weapon. But the bigger difference, and the one that many people I think would have been surprised by if you fought these guys originally in the North American version, and then in later years you came back to fight them again, you could be in for a rude awakening because you wouldn't have expected the stat change. Omega Weapon is actually a lot beefier in the later versions of the game. Originally, in the Japanese and North American versions, Omega Weapon only had 99,999 HP. From 2002 releases onwards, Omega Weapon jumps up all the way to basically 1 million HP. That is an absolutely massive change. He goes from being basically an endgame, high-level random encounter kind of HP to almost super boss kind of HP, which is a big change. His MP goes up from 1 to 999, which is kind of interesting because he's susceptible to Osmose now, and so Osmosing this guy is a viable strategy to get MP back if that's what you need. He's much harder to overkill now. Previously he only needed 13,560 for an overkill. Now he needs 66,666, which is going to be pretty difficult for a lot of parties unless you've really upped your stats pretty high. Now, he gets a lot more increases in Ultima Weapon. They're really pushing him to be this sort of, not really a super boss, but a legit endgame optional boss. His strength goes up from 54 to 64, magic goes up from 50 to 57, defense goes up from 80 to 90, magic defense goes from 20 all the way up to 80, and his agility goes up from 32 to 38. Now, again, if you look back at the stat mechanics stuff, he goes up another tier of tick speed. So previously he had a tick speed of 8, but he now has a tick speed of 7, which makes him, of course, a little bit faster in battle and a little bit more dangerous. Previously, if you used elemental attacks, he would halve the damage, but now he actually absorbs them, which makes him even more difficult to deal with. His physical attack no longer misses and has a shatter rate of 100% instead of 10%. He's got an increased chance of dealing a critical hit and can break the damage limit. So Omega Weapon is one of the biggest changes between the original versions of the game and the later ones. One thing that I think is worth mentioning is a glitch that is only present on one of the earlier versions. Not quite the earliest version, but the 2002 international version of Final Fantasy X has something called the home glitch. If you've never heard of this one, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but it's almost like a mini weird New Game Plus kind of situation that you can generate in Al Bhed Home. There's a video I've made, of course, on it, and it's well worth checking out too. But that's a glitch that was only ever present in one version of the game, but because it's one of the earliest versions of the game from 2002, I thought it's still worth mentioning here because it's a pretty huge glitch and can be very fun to mess around with and test out. Then for over 10 years there was nothing. We didn't get any other versions of the game. Basically, the international and then PAL version of the game that came out in mid-2002 was the most up-to-date version of Final Fantasy X that we had. Then, of course, we got the Final Fantasy X HD Remaster. This was based largely on the international/PAL version of the game, so a lot of the things that you would see in terms of gameplay are going to match the 2002 PAL version pretty identically. So all of the Dark Aeons, all of the ribbon, all of the stat changes to the bosses, the new moves that were added, the Yojimbo mechanics, pretty much all of that stuff is going to be the same as it was in 2002. Of course, the things that change that are obvious that it's not worth going into too much detail on is the fact that we've got new character models, which personally for Tidus and Yuna I don't particularly like, and I think that's not an unpopular opinion, but the character models of course changed as a result of the HD remaster. But another thing that of course changed was the fact that we could now play the game widescreen natively. Originally, Final Fantasy X, due to the time in which it came out, widescreen TVs were not the norm, and so those games were in 4:3 aspect ratio instead of the 16:9 that pretty much all of us use to this day, unless you are a legit retro gamer and you've got some old school CRT monitors or something that you like to play your old school games with. So yeah, of course we end up with natively widescreen Final Fantasy X thanks to the HD remaster. So we of course know the Cavern of the Stolen Faith area where you meet and fight Yojimbo. Previously it used to for some reason be called Sunken Cave in the English version of the game. Those of us that played like the older versions of the game will definitely remember when it used to be called Sunken Cave in the Monster Arena. But as of the HD remaster, they now refer to it as Stolen Faith Cavern instead, which is a lot more accurate and the way it should have been. One weird little change that I literally had to look up because I wasn't sure if it was true was the fact that Yuna, Lulu and Riku no longer speak or like make a noise when Tidus uses Blitz Ace. This is going to sound like kind of pointless and weird. I have no idea why this was removed, but sure enough I looked back at the old PS2 version of the game, and like for example when Riku tosses the ball to Tidus for Blitz Ace, she shouts "Yee-hoo!" and for some reason Yuna, Lulu and Riku's vocal during the Blitz Ace sequence has been removed from the HD remaster version onwards. But one change that definitely is deliberate is actually a little small glitch slash hack from the Monster Arena. For every version of the game up until the HD Remaster, whenever you fought Fenrir in the Monster Arena, for some reason you wouldn't actually get charged. You'd end up fighting it for free, which was pretty cool because honestly, I don't think by the time you're farming Fenrir, you're in need of Gil. But it doesn't change the fact that obviously the game should charge you Gil, and it doesn't. This was fixed in the HD Remaster version, and fighting Fenrir will cost you Gil from the HD Remaster version onwards. And then finally we have the more advanced versions of the HD Remaster, which is basically for me the Steam version of the game. The Steam version of the game, even though it's not technically the latest one that got released, it's probably the most advanced one with the most features and the highest number of changes over the first one that ever came out in July 2001. The main thing worth talking about for the Steam version is of course the extra quality of life improvements that it gives you over even the standard HD remaster of the game back on the PS3 and the PS4. You have autosave functionality as a result of the Steam version, you have an option to skip certain FMV cutscenes, and then you have the boosters within the game. The most important one for me is always the turbo mode. You can speed the game up by 2 times or 4 times, which makes farming so much easier, and I'm so glad that they have it for the Steam version. That's why it's always one of the best versions to play in terms of the gameplay, because that's such a big quality of life improvement. If you're trying to get all of the achievements and all that kind of stuff, it is an important feature. You have the supercharge ability if you need a little bit of extra help in battle. Characters and Aeons have their HP, MP and overdrive gauges fully restored when it's their turn, which is of course a major cheat, but at the end of the day, if you need it and it's useful to you, why the hell not? Another major thing that you can do, of course, is to be able to turn off enemy encounters. Normally, to be able to do this in the game, you have to get the Purifying Salts and you have to customize yourself a no encounters piece of equipment, or you have to get lucky and receive a drop that contains it. Now, the fact that you can do this basically from the moment you start the game is, to me, a massive deal and a big quality of life improvement, depending on how you want to play the game. And the final one is a bit of a weird one that I've never tried that much. It's the auto battle ability. I'm sure this can be useful in certain farming situations, but I've never really needed it. But you can get your characters and Aeons to attack automatically, which is kind of interesting and something that might be worth playing around with if you ever do play the Steam version of the game. So there we have it, guys. That is a pretty extensive list. Now, individually, a lot of these changes aren't huge, but if you add together all of these changes and you look at, let's say, the Steam version of the game as it exists today, when you compare it to the very first version of the game that came out in July 2001, and even the North American version that came out in December 2001, there have been a lot of changes. Now, I want to end with something special for you guys, because there is one thing that has not changed, and I want to mention this because it's such a legendary meme for the Final Fantasy X community, and it's of course going to be the kid who says, "I'm going to be a blitzball when I grow up." You're wondering, there's been all of these changes going on in the game, it's been 21 years, why have they not changed it? Is it just because the team themselves also see it as such a meme and they refuse to change it? Maybe, but the actual story behind this is the fact that the original Japanese version of the game in 2001 already had a typo when they were actually making the game. So the English version that we know is not the way it is because of a translation error. It's a correct translation of a typo that was present in the original version of the game. Now, kind of tragically, I think, in the Japanese version of the HD remaster, they've actually quote-unquote corrected it, and the kid says, "I want to be a blitzball player when I grow up." But because the English HD remaster is basically just pulling all of the strings from the English versions of the game, which are based on the typo from the original, that's why in the original version of the HD remaster, we still get to keep the legendary line, and it remains canon for all of us English language players. So for me, that's a funny thing that did not change in the English version of the game, and I'm always glad that it didn't, because it's a legendary line, and it always puts a smile on my face whenever I encounter it during a playthrough. So I wanted to end with that. Thank you all so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. And if it's the first video of mine that you've watched, hopefully this will send you down a rabbit hole of Dan's great Final Fantasy X content, because there is, of course, so much of it dating all the way back to 2008 that I'm sure you have a wonderful time watching it. Shout out to everyone on Patreon for supporting these kinds of videos. You guys make a massive difference to the channel, and you guys also of course get early access to this content, and you get to see it before anyone else and help me find any mistakes or issues in the video as well. So definitely appreciate you guys. Shout out to the channel members as well. Thank you for all of your support and your participation in the community. I'll be back with more Final Fantasy X content in the future as always. Have more things in the pipeline, just need to decide which ones I want to do in which particular order. So hope you guys enjoyed the video and learned something. I will see you soon. Take care.